The frozen ground shuddered beneath the weight of countless steel treads. December 15th, 1944. Schmidheim, Germany. Obergefreiter Hans Müller felt the vibrations travel up through his bones as he sat cramped in the back of the lurching half-track. Column after column of panzer tanks disappeared into the black mouth of the Eifel forests. Their engines roared like distant thunder. Exhaust fumes mixed with the bitter December air. Metal tracks chewed through mud and ice, leaving deep scars in the earth. Tomorrow would bring everything. Tomorrow would reshape the war. Tomorrow, the Reich would prove its strength, still burned bright. Müller's fingers trembled around his pen, not from cold, though the air cut like knives, from fear, from knowledge that could get him shot if his officers ever found his diary. The words formed slowly in his mind before he dared write them. We are told this offensive will split the Allies. They say it will force peace negotiations. I want to believe this promise. God knows how desperately I want to believe. But I have seen what we face now. I have watched our cities disappear under waves of bombers. The sky turns black with their formations. Buildings that stood for centuries crumble in minutes. Now we roll toward Belgium with fuel tanks barely half full. Enough gasoline to reach the Meuse River if everything goes perfectly. If nothing goes wrong. If the Americans cooperate with our plans. The mathematics make no sense. Deep in every soldier's heart, this truth sits like a stone. We know what we lack. We know what victory requires. We know the gap between dreams and reality. The front stretched across 75 miles of frozen wilderness. From Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, over 200,000 German soldiers prepared for battle. Adolf Hitler had named it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Even the name was deception. It suggested defensive operations along Germany's western border. Guards watching the river. Soldiers protecting the homeland. Nothing more threatening than sentries on duty. Reality was far more ambitious. The Wehrmacht's last desperate gamble to change everything. To alter the course of World War II with one massive blow. 3 German armies would smash through American positions in the Ardennes forest. The Americans had spread their forces thin across this quiet sector. They believed the Ardennes too difficult for major operations, the forest roads too narrow, the terrain too broken. German planners saw opportunity where Americans saw obstacles. The offensive would punch through weak defenses, cross the Meuse River in massive strength, drive 100 miles to Antwerp, Belgium's vital port city. Success would split British and American forces completely, cut their supply lines, force negotiated peace in the West, free Germany to concentrate everything against Soviet armies advancing from the east. Field commanders who heard Hitler present the plan sat in stunned silence. The Führer had conceived every detail personally. He dismissed objections from General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt as defeatism. He ignored concerns from General Feldmarschall Walter Model as lack of faith. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army. He sat through planning conferences at the Wolf's Lair with growing dread settling in his stomach. Manteuffel was a veteran of the Eastern Front. His tank divisions had beaten back Soviet offensives repeatedly through superior tactics and battlefield mobility. No officer in the German military understood armored warfare better than Manteuffel. He knew exactly what this operation required. He knew with equal clarity that Germany no longer possessed the resources to execute it. December the 2nd brought a private meeting with Hitler. Manteuffel carefully outlined his concerns. His voice remained respectful. His manner stayed professional. His words carried the weight of hard experience. The offensive required surprise above all else, favorable weather to ground Allied aircraft, rapid advance to prevent American reinforcement. Most critically, captured American fuel depots because German supplies could barely sustain the initial thrust. Without all these elements aligning perfectly, the offensive would fail. Mathematical certainty, not pessimism. Hitler waved these objections away with an impatient gesture. German soldiers possessed superior will and fighting spirit. These qualities would overcome material disadvantages. Victory came from determination, not gasoline. What the Führer refused to acknowledge sat in plain sight on staff tables. Charts showing fuel consumption rates, reports detailing ammunition stockpiles, inventories of replacement parts and spare vehicles. Superior will could not propel tanks without gasoline. Fighting spirit could not produce ammunition for empty guns. Determination could not replace the 800 aircraft and 1,500 tanks Germany would commit to an operation with perhaps 10% chance of success. The force assembled for Wacht am Rhein represented Germany's final strategic reserve. Everything left after 5 years of war. The 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich would deliver the main thrust in the north, drive past Liege to Antwerp. Despite commanding Germany's most powerful armored formation, Dietrich had never demonstrated competence at operational level. A loyal Nazi and personal favorite of Hitler since the early party days. Dietrich had risen through ranks based on political reliability rather than military skill. General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt called him decent but stupid in private conversations. Model had protested his appointment to no avail. Politics trumped competence in the Third Reich's final gamble. The 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel would attack through the center, drive toward Bastogne and Namur before wheeling north to meet Dietrich's forces. To the south, General der Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would shield the offensive's southern flank. Brandenberger commanded infantry divisions that lacked mobility or firepower to do more than slow American counterattacks. His men would hold the door open while the panzer armies raced for Antwerp. On paper, the numbers looked impressive enough to inspire confidence. Over 400,000 men would participate in various stages of the offensive. Approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns had been scraped together from every corner of the shrinking Reich. 2,600 artillery pieces, 1,000 combat aircraft. These figures concealed devastating weaknesses that staff officers understood but dared not discuss openly. Many of the 30 divisions allocated to the offensive were rebuilt formations, units destroyed earlier and reconstituted with whatever men could be found. Teenagers barely old enough to shave, men over 40 who belonged in factories, not foxholes. Soldiers who had received minimal training because time and resources did not exist for proper preparation. The panzer divisions looked formidable on organization charts, equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks that outgunned anything the Americans possessed. But they lacked sufficient support vehicles. Spare parts had become impossibly scarce. Most critically, fuel supplies barely existed. Staff officers calculated that the offensive had enough gasoline to advance 30 to 40 miles. The Meuse River lay 80 miles from starting positions. Antwerp was 125 miles distant. The plan's success depended entirely on capturing American fuel dumps intact during the first days. If the Americans destroyed their supplies as they retreated, the entire German armored spearhead would grind to a halt deep in enemy territory. The deception had been masterful in its execution. Radio silence maintained for weeks. All movement conducted at night. the code name suggesting defensive operations rather than offensive action. Allied intelligence had detected no signs of the massive buildup occurring just miles from their front lines. American commanders believed Germany incapable of mounting major offensive operations at this stage of the war. The Ardennes sector, where the offensive would strike, was held by 4 divisions. 2 inexperienced units recently arrived from America. 2 battle-worn formations resting in what soldiers called the Ghost Front, a quiet sector where nothing ever happened. Deception and surprise could only carry the offensive so far. Every German field commander understood the race against time that would begin the moment artillery opened fire. American reinforcements would pour into the Ardennes within hours. December 16th dawned cold and foggy across the Ardennes region. The forest lay silent under a blanket of low clouds. Visibility dropped to mere yards. Perfect weather for surprise attack. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, 1,600 German artillery pieces erupted in coordinated fury. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. Shell after shell crashed into American positions scattered throughout the forest. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann commanded a Panzer IV tank in the 2nd Panzer Division. He had experienced Soviet artillery barrages on the Eastern Front that made this bombardment seem modest by comparison. But he watched American positions disintegrate under the shell fire with grim satisfaction. Perhaps they had been wrong to doubt. Perhaps surprise and violence would be enough after all. His tank lurched forward as the infantry assault wave moved out ahead of the armor. Behind him, dozens of panzers rolled toward Belgium. Their engines roared through the morning mist. Steel tracks clanked over frozen ground. In the turret, Zimmermann checked his fuel gauge with practiced eyes, 3/4 full, enough to reach the Meuse if they moved quickly, if they encountered no serious obstacles, if everything went according to the detailed plan. Every tanker in the long column understood that the word "if" was doing heavy lifting this December morning. The 6th Panzer Army's attack in the north ran into immediate problems that no one had anticipated. At Lanzerath, a single American reconnaissance platoon supported by artillery observers held up an entire German parachute battalion for 10 precious hours. Just one platoon, 30 men with rifles and determination. When SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper, reached Lanzerath that evening, he found the paratroopers still pinned down by stubborn American resistance. Peiper was 29 years old, a former aide to Heinrich Himmler, who had earned his reputation for aggressive armored tactics on the Eastern Front. Tall, blond, and fanatically devoted to the SS ideal, he commanded approximately 4,800 men with 117 tanks and numerous support vehicles. His orders were simple in concept, brutal in execution. Break through American defenses. Drive to the Meuse without stopping. Ignore flanks and bypass enemy positions. Seize bridges before they could be destroyed. He was the spearhead of the spearhead. His success or failure would determine the entire offensive's fate. The weight of Germany's last gamble rested on his shoulders. Furious at the delay, Peiper ordered his tanks forward at midnight. He led the column personally, standing in the turret of his command tank. His Kampfgruppe wound through narrow forest roads in complete darkness. Engine noise echoed through valleys like approaching thunder. The attack plan had called for Peiper to reach the Meuse in 12 hours. He was already 6 hours behind schedule, and had not yet broken free of American defensive positions. At Honsfeld, Peiper's tanks overran American positions in a brief but vicious engagement. The Americans had been caught completely by surprise. Some were still sleeping when German tanks rumbled into their bivouac areas. Peiper captured vehicles, supplies, and hundreds of prisoners in the swift attack. He paused only to refuel from captured American dumps before pushing west again. His columns stretched for miles through the dark forest, a river of steel flowing toward the Meuse. But narrow roads built for farm traffic, not armor, created massive traffic jams that consumed precious time. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and self-propelled guns backed up for hours. Engines idled, burning fuel while crews waited helplessly for the jam to clear. December 17th brought an encounter that would haunt the offensive and transform its character completely. At a crossroads near Baugny outside Malmedy, elements of Kampfgruppe Piper encountered an American convoy from Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After a brief firefight, the Americans surrendered. What happened next violated every convention of warfare and ensured that no quarter would be given by either side. SS troops herded approximately 120 American prisoners into a field. Machine guns opened fire without warning. Those who survived the initial volley and tried to escape were hunted down like animals. Wounded men were finished off with pistol shots to the head. When the killing stopped, 84 Americans lay dead in the snow. Their blood steamed in the cold air. Bodies twisted in final agony. Word of the massacre spread through American units with terrifying speed. Radio reports, wounded survivors who had played dead among the corpses, soldiers who discovered the killing field. Shock and confusion transformed into cold rage that burned like ice in every American heart. Soldiers who had been prepared to surrender when faced with overwhelming German assaults now fought with desperate ferocity. The massacre at Malmedy transformed the battle's character completely. Americans would yield no ground willingly. They would fight from every position until death or victory ended the struggle. In Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army sector, the offensive achieved greater initial success through different tactics. Manteufel had argued successfully for attacking without preliminary artillery bombardment, achieving even more complete surprise. His forces smashed through positions held by the 106th Infantry Division like a hammer through glass. The American division had arrived in the Ardennes only days earlier, green troops with no combat experience, expecting quiet duty in a quiet sector. German tanks appeared out of the morning fog without warning. Panic spread through American ranks. 2 entire regiments were encircled in the initial assault. Nearly 9,000 American soldiers surrendered over the following days, the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in the European theater. Manteuffel's tanks raced toward vital road junctions at Saint-Vith and Bastogne. These towns controlled the Ardennes road network like keys to locked doors. If they fell quickly, nothing could stop the German advance to the Meuse. Oberst Meinrad von Lauchert commanded the 2nd Panzer Division driving toward the Meuse. He pushed his tanks forward with reckless speed, bypassing American strongpoints and leaving them for follow-on infantry, while his panzers plunged deeper into Belgium. On maps at 5th Army headquarters, the penetration looked decisive. German forces had advanced up to 20 miles in some sectors. Red arrows showed American defenses apparently collapsing across the front. For one brief moment, it seemed possible that Hitler's impossible gamble might actually succeed. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke commanded a Panther tank in the advance. He was a veteran panzer officer who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. But he watched his fuel gauge with growing anxiety that had nothing to do with enemy action. They had advanced 15 miles and already burned through half their fuel. The narrow forest roads wound endlessly through thick trees, preventing cross-country movement. Every bypass around obstacles consumed more gasoline. Every detour to avoid blown bridges ate into their reserves. Rodke's company had started the offensive with 22 tanks. 3 had already broken down from mechanical problems, victims of inadequate maintenance and worn-out engines that had seen too much combat. German industry was still producing excellent tanks, but spare parts had become impossible to obtain. Replacement engines did not exist. Maintenance schedules had been abandoned under the pressure of continuous operations. The crews had been told to expect captured American fuel dumps along their route. Intelligence promised enemy supply points every few miles, easy targets ripe for seizure. They had encountered nothing but destroyed supply points where retreating Americans had torched everything before falling back. Blackened vehicles, smoking fuel drums, the acrid smell of burning gasoline. The mathematics were becoming clear to every tank commander. At this rate of consumption, they would run out of fuel somewhere between St. Vith and the Meuse. Tanks without fuel were nothing but steel coffins waiting for American aircraft to find them. The weather, which had been Germany's greatest ally, began to shift on December 18th. The fog and clouds that had grounded Allied air forces started to thin. Gaps appeared in the overcast sky. American fighter bombers appeared over the battlefield for the first time since the offensive began. They attacked German columns with devastating effect that shocked troops accustomed to Luftwaffe protection. Hauptmann Hans Schmidt commanded a company of Panzer Grenadiers moving through the forest. He watched P-47 Thunderbolts strafe his column, destroying 3 trucks and a half-track in seconds of concentrated fire. The fighters appeared without warning, diving through gaps in the clouds. Rockets and cannon fire erupted from their wings. Explosions walked down the road like deadly footsteps. Then they climbed back into the overcast and vanished. Against aircraft, German ground forces were nearly defenseless. The Luftwaffe had promised fighter cover for the offensive, but few German planes appeared over the battlefield. Most of Germany's remaining aircraft had been held back to support a separate operation. Fuel shortages limited combat sorties to mere handfuls. Experienced pilots had become impossibly scarce. Training programs had been cut to practically nothing. American planes appeared with increasing frequency as the weather continued to clear. They left German vehicles burning along roadways like torches marking the path of defeat. The advance slowed repeatedly as units took cover, waiting for fighters to pass. At La Glaise, Piper's Kampfgruppe had ground to a complete halt, surrounded by American forces that had materialized from the forest, completely out of fuel after days of continuous movement. From 4,800 men and 117 tanks, Piper now commanded fewer than 800 soldiers and 25 armored vehicles immobilized by empty fuel tanks. American artillery pounded the village continuously. Shells crashed into buildings every few minutes. American infantry and tanks tightened the noose around the trapped Germans with methodical precision. December 22nd brought a Luftwaffe resupply drop intended to deliver fuel and ammunition to Piper's trapped force. The transport planes flew through heavy anti-aircraft fire to reach the drop zone. 90% of the supplies scattered across the countryside, falling into American hands instead of German ones. Parachutes drifted on winter winds, carrying hope away from the men who needed it most. Piper radioed for permission to break out on foot, abandoning his vehicles. The request traveled up the chain of command to Dietrich, who forwarded it to Hitler himself. The answer came back the following day in typical fashion. Hold your position. Reinforcements are coming. Victory requires determination. But Piper knew no reinforcements would arrive. American forces held every approach route in strength. His men were eating their last rations. Wounded soldiers lay in cellars with minimal medical care. On December 23rd, Piper made the decision to withdraw without permission. That night, 800 survivors abandoned their tanks and vehicles. They slipped through American lines on foot, moving like ghosts through the frozen forest. Days later, the survivors reached German positions, exhausted and defeated. Kampfgruppe Piper, the most powerful armored formation in the offensive, had been destroyed without achieving any strategic objective. The pattern repeated across the entire front with monotonous regularity. At St. Vith, American defenders held out far longer than German planners had anticipated. The town controlled critical road junctions until December 21st, tying up German forces that should have been racing toward the Meuse. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions created an impenetrable northern shoulder. German attacks broke against their positions like waves against a stone breakwater. The ridge channeled the 6th Panzer Army into narrow valleys, where American artillery slaughtered German infantry attempting to break through. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division arrived just before German forces could seize the town. They created a fortress that absorbed attack after attack without yielding an inch of ground. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps surrounding Bastogne. He sent a surrender ultimatum to the American commander on December 22nd. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply entered military legend immediately: nuts. When German officers asked for clarification of this peculiar response, they were told it meant go to hell in American slang. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne through Christmas, while Manteufel's panzers attempted to bypass the town and continue west. But the roads radiating from Bastogne were essential for supply and reinforcement. Without controlling the town, German forces could not sustain their westward advance. December 24th brought the weather conditions that German planners had dreaded from the beginning. Clear skies dawned over the Ardennes for the first time in more than a week. Visibility extended for miles in every direction. Within hours, the sky filled with Allied aircraft like a swarm of metal locusts. Over 5,000 sorties flew that single day. Fighter bombers hammered German supply columns, attacked stalled tank formations, dropped supplies to surrounded American forces. Feldwebel Karl Meyer commanded a Tiger tank battalion that had been the pride of the German army. He watched in helpless fury as P-47 fighter bombers methodically destroyed his supply convoy. Without ammunition, his Tigers were useless steel monuments. Without fuel, they could not move to engage targets. American fighter pilots had learned to target fuel trucks first, knowing that immobilized German armor could be dealt with at leisure. Meyer's battalion had started the offensive with 45 Tigers, the most feared tank on any battlefield. Now only 19 remained operational. The rest had been abandoned for lack of fuel, destroyed by air attack, or knocked out in close-quarter fighting. The Tiger possessed armor that could shrug off most American tank rounds. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied vehicle at long range. But none of that mattered when the tanks sat motionless, fuel tanks empty, while American fighter bombers circled overhead like vultures waiting for carrion. By December 25th, Christmas Day, the offensive had reached its high water mark. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had pushed to within 4 miles of the Meuse River near Dinant, the deepest German penetration of the entire operation. But this spearhead was cut off, surrounded, and completely out of fuel. To the north, British tanks of XXX Corps held the Meuse crossings in overwhelming strength. To the south, Patton's Third Army had disengaged from its positions in Lorraine with remarkable speed. Patton had pivoted 90 degrees north and slammed into the southern flank of the German salient with characteristic violence. The weather had turned decisively against Germany. American artillery spotters called down devastating fire on German positions with complete visibility. Allied logistics functioned with machine-like efficiency that defied belief. Thousands of tons of supplies arrived daily at forward positions. Meanwhile, German supply columns burned under relentless air attack. The bulge that gave the battle its popular name had reached maximum extension. Now, the Allies were going to squeeze it shut with methodical precision. Hauptmann Otto Krebs had commanded a Panzer Grenadier company through the opening days of the offensive. Now he sat in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne on Christmas Day, trying to comprehend what had gone wrong. They had achieved complete surprise. American forces had been caught completely off guard. German forces had broken through enemy lines in multiple sectors. They had advanced up to 30 miles in some areas. And yet they had failed completely. The Americans had not collapsed as predicted. Every small town became a fortress. Every crossroads turned into a battlefield. Every mile was paid for in blood and fuel they could not afford. His company had started the offensive with 160 men. 48 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing in the chaos of retreat. They had no ammunition for their mortars, barely enough rifle rounds for one more engagement. No prospect of resupply, because American aircraft controlled every road during daylight hours. Christmas dinner consisted of frozen bread and weak coffee made from grounds used 3 times already. Meanwhile, Krebs could hear American artillery firing continuously. The shells supplied by an endless logistical network that seemed to have no limits whatsoever. He had fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years. He had seen massive Soviet offensives that crushed German positions through sheer weight of numbers and material. Waves of men and tanks that seemed endless. This was different and somehow worse. The Americans fought with precision, with coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft that the Soviets had never achieved. And they did it while keeping their soldiers well-fed, well-equipped, and supported by logistics that defied belief. At German headquarters, the reality of failure slowly penetrated layers of denial and wishful thinking. Model and von Rundstedt repeatedly requested permission to withdraw German forces before American counterattacks encircled and destroyed them entirely. Hitler refused every request. He ordered renewed attacks toward the Meuse, insisting that victory was still possible if commanders showed sufficient determination and fighting spirit. December 26th brought Patton's 4th Armored Division breaking through to Bastogne, opening a corridor into the besieged town. Americans immediately began pouring reinforcements and supplies into Bastogne, transforming it from a defensive position into a base for counterattacks. Manteuffel's forces, which had bypassed Bastogne thinking it contained only a small garrison, now found a reinforced American strongpoint in their rear, threatening supply lines and blocking roads they needed for any hope of retreat. January 1st, 1945, brought the Luftwaffe's final major operation of the entire war. Operation Bodenplatte. Over 900 German aircraft launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, destroying approximately 200 Allied planes on the ground. For a few hours, it seemed Germany could still strike devastating blows against enemy air power. Smoking aircraft littered runways. Fuel dumps burned with towering flames. Hangars collapsed in twisted metal. But the operation proved to be a strategic disaster of the first magnitude. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 280 aircraft destroyed. More than 230 pilots were killed, missing, captured, or wounded. Among the casualties were wing commanders, squadron leaders, and irreplaceable experienced aviators who represented Germany's last reservoir of aerial expertise. The Allies replaced their lost planes within days from seemingly unlimited production. Germany would never recover the pilots or aircraft lost in what proved to be the Luftwaffe's death blow against itself. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's highest-scoring fighter pilots, watched the returning aircraft land at bases across Germany. Growing horror settled in his chest as the losses became clear through radio reports. The Luftwaffe had gambled everything on one operation and lost catastrophically. From this point forward, German ground forces would fight without meaningful air cover, while Allied fighter bombers hunted them relentlessly across every battlefield. The German offensive had created a bulge 60 miles deep and 40 miles wide at its base, but it had failed to reach any strategic objective whatsoever. The Meuse remained in Allied hands. Antwerp was unthreatened. Allied armies had not been split or encircled. Most critically for Germany's future, the offensive had consumed the Reich's last strategic reserves of men, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. Every panzer division committed to the Ardennes was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Replacements did not exist. New tanks could not be produced in sufficient numbers. Fuel reserves were exhausted. Germany had shot its final bolt and missed the target completely. The offensive had devoured supplies like a starving beast. Months of careful accumulation vanished in days. Germany's warehouses sat empty. Their fuel depots ran dry. Every shell fired was one they could never replace. The mathematics of war had turned against them completely. January 3rd brought American fury from two directions. Northern forces struck hard. Southern units hammered relentlessly. Their goal was simple and devastating. Pinch off the German bulge. Trap every enemy soldier inside. Hitler waited until January 8th to authorize withdrawal. Too late. Far too late. The window for organized retreat had already slammed shut. German forces stumbled backward under crushing pressure. Every step was a battle. Every mile cost lives. Rearguard actions became desperate struggles. American ground forces pressed forward without pause. Allied aircraft swarmed overhead whenever clouds parted. The retreat became a nightmare of destruction and abandonment. One tank commander in the 9th Panzer Division captured the horror in letters he never sent. His words were found among personal effects after death claimed him in February 1945. The testimony reads like an epitaph for German hopes. Their own vehicles became funeral pyres. No fuel remained to move them. Destruction was the only option. Better to burn equipment than let enemies capture it. Every road told the same story. Abandoned equipment choked the pathways. Broken trucks lined the ditches. Burned tanks sat like monuments to failure. The Americans pursued without mercy. Day bled into night without respite. Their aircraft appeared the moment weather cleared. Fighters dove from cloudless skies. Bombs fell with mechanical precision. Artillery shells followed German columns with supernatural accuracy. The offensive had begun with such promise. Victory seemed possible. The war's outcome might change. Now reality crushed those dreams. Fighting meant only one thing: escape the trap they had created for themselves. The men no longer spoke of victory. Such words had lost all meaning. Survival became the only goal. Reaching German lines alive. Finding shelter from American shells. Avoiding the bombs that fell like metal rain. Everyone understood the terrible truth. This was the beginning of the end. The Ardennes gamble had failed completely. Germany possessed no reserves, no fuel, no illusions. Russian armies approached from the east. American and British forces pressed from the west. Germany had exhausted itself in one final offensive. The attack gained nothing. It achieved nothing except hastening their own destruction. January 25, 1945, marked the end. Germans were pushed back to starting positions. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The statistics painted a picture of catastrophic failure. Germany had committed approximately 400,000 men to the offensive. Between 80,000 and 100,000 became casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. Approximately 12,000 were killed outright. The Wehrmacht lost 600 tanks and assault guns, vehicles that could never be replaced. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft. Irreplaceable pilots died in flaming wreckage. German fuel reserves, accumulated over months, were completely exhausted. Artillery ammunition carefully stockpiled for the offensive simply vanished. The offensive had consumed Germany's capacity for major operations. Never again would Germany launch an attack of such scale. The capability was gone forever. American casualties numbered approximately 81,000. This included 19,000 killed. But America could replace these losses. Ships from America arrived daily. Fresh divisions disembarked. New equipment filled warehouses. Endless supplies flowed across the Atlantic. American dead would be mourned deeply. Their sacrifice would be remembered, but their loss would not cripple American military operations. America's industrial capacity remained untouched. Their reserves seemed infinite. Germany's dead represented irreplaceable losses. Wounded soldiers could not return to combat. Captured men were lost forever. The strategic cost was even more significant than immediate casualties. The offensive delayed Allied plans to cross the Rhine. Approximately 6 weeks were gained, but it also delayed Soviet operations in the east. Stalin had launched a massive winter offensive on January 12th. This forced Germany to shift reinforcements eastward. They moved at the worst possible moment, when forces were most needed to defend the Ardennes. Hitler had gambled on decisive Western victory. This would allow concentration against the Soviets. Instead, the Ardennes consumed forces desperately needed in the east. It achieved nothing in the west. When Soviets launched their Vistula-Oder offensive, they encountered weakened German defenses. They advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks. Soviet forces reached the Oder River less than 50 miles from Berlin. The panzer divisions destroyed in the Ardennes could have slowed this advance. Not stopped it, but slowed it significantly. Instead, they lay wrecked in Belgian forests, monuments to strategic delusion and tactical futility. One colonel who commanded a Volksgrenadier division wrote a detailed after-action report. The document was never submitted. By the time he finished writing, no functioning command structure existed to receive such reports. His analysis was brutally honest and completely damning. The Ardennes offensive failed because it was based on assumptions with no basis in reality. Complete surprise was assumed. This was achieved initially. Bad weather was assumed to ground Allied aircraft. This occurred for 1 week only. Rapid advance was assumed to prevent American reinforcement. This proved impossible on roads designed for farm traffic, not armored columns. Captured American fuel was assumed to sustain the advance. Americans destroyed their supplies. German forces could not reach remaining depots. American forces were assumed to collapse under initial assault. Instead, even newly arrived divisions fought with determination. They delayed German advance at every crossroads. Every village became a battlefield. German will to win was assumed to overcome material disadvantages. As if courage could substitute for gasoline, determination could replace ammunition. Fighting spirit could overcome absolute Allied air superiority. Most fundamentally, Success was assumed because Hitler ordered it. This was not military planning. This was magical thinking. It destroyed the last forces capable of defending Germany. The aftermath brought consequences far beyond simple military defeat. The 6th Panzer Army achieved so little in the Ardennes. It was ordered to Hungary for a final offensive near Lake Balaton. This attack launched in March 1945. It failed completely against Soviet defenses. The 6th Panzer Army was effectively destroyed. Germany's last mobile reserve vanished in Hungarian mud. Dietrich survived the war. He was tried for war crimes at Malmedy. He received a life sentence, later reduced. He was released from prison in 1955. He died in 1966, never acknowledging the massacre his forces committed. Piper was also convicted for war crimes at Malmedy. Initially sentenced to death, later reduced to life imprisonment. Released in 1956, he moved to France, where he lived under an assumed name until 1976. His identity was discovered. His house was firebombed. Piper was killed. The old massacre finally caught up with him. 31 years after the events at Bonnier Crossroads, Manteuffel survived the war. He surrendered to the British. He served a brief prison term. He later entered West German politics. He served in the Bundestag. He coined the term Bundeswehr for West Germany's new armed forces. He lectured at West Point about the Ardennes campaign. He analyzed how American flexibility and logistics defeated German armored tactics. In interviews during the 1970s, Manteuffel was candid about the offensive's futility. From a purely military standpoint, the Ardennes attack made no sense. Germany lacked resources to reach Antwerp. They lacked fuel to sustain advance beyond the Meuse. They lacked air power to protect columns from Allied fighter bombers. They lacked reserves to exploit any breakthrough achieved. The offensive succeeded tactically in achieving surprise. It succeeded in breaking through American lines. It failed operationally because advance could not be sustained. It failed strategically because even reaching Antwerp was impossible. Such success would not have forced Allied negotiation. It would not have changed the war's fundamental outcome. Germany was already defeated. The Ardennes offensive simply accelerated the final collapse. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the difference between tactical proficiency and strategic reality. German soldiers fought with skill and determination throughout the offensive. German commanders executed complex operations under difficult conditions. German tank crews showed tactical superiority in individual engagements. None of it mattered. Germany lacked industrial capacity. They lacked logistics. They lacked resources to sustain offensive operations. Americans had been surprised and badly hurt, but their response illustrated the power of material superiority. It demonstrated organizational depth. Within days, Eisenhower had shifted divisions across hundreds of miles. Command structures were reorganized rapidly. Overwhelming force was concentrated against the German penetration. American logistics delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily. Winter weather could not stop them. Damaged roads could not halt them. American industry replaced every lost tank. Every destroyed truck. Every expended artillery shell. The battle was not won by superior American tactics. It was not won by battlefield performance. In many engagements, German forces demonstrated higher tactical skill. The battle was won by American logistics, by industrial capacity that could absorb losses and replace them overnight, by an army that could shift corps-sized formations hundreds of miles in response to crisis, by complete air superiority that allowed American fighters to hunt German columns at will. For Germany, the Ardennes represented the death of strategic flexibility. After the offensive collapsed, the Wehrmacht fought purely defensive operations. The initiative passed completely to the Allies. In the east, Soviet armies advanced inexorably toward Berlin. In the west, American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine. Germany's cities were systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. Oil production collapsed under air attack. Transportation networks disintegrated. Food supplies ran short. Industrial capacity that had sustained 4 years of war was crumbling. German soldiers no longer fought for victory. They fought to delay defeat, to keep Allied armies away from German cities for another day, another week, another month. They fought because the alternative was surrender. They had been conditioned to believe surrender was betrayal. They fought because despite everything, despite destroyed cities and millions dead, despite the complete hopelessness of their position, the Nazi regime still held Germany in its grip. Desertion meant death for the soldier, persecution for his family. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties. It consumed irreplaceable equipment, fuel, and ammunition. In return, Germany achieved nothing of strategic value. The offensive delayed Allied operations by 6 weeks. It forced Western allies to postpone their crossing of the Rhine from February to March 1945. That was the sum total of German achievement. For this delay, Germany sacrificed its last mobile reserves. This ensured that when Allies finally crossed the Rhine, they encountered weakened defenses that collapsed rapidly. For this delay, Germany sacrificed panzer divisions desperately needed against Soviet offensives in the east. For this delay, Germany consumed fuel reserves that might have powered a fighting withdrawal. Such resources could have prolonged resistance significantly. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last gamble. It was a catastrophic failure, perhaps the most expensive failure of the entire war. It consumed resources Germany could not afford to lose. It pursued objectives Germany could never achieve. One infantry soldier who participated in the opening assault survived the war. He served in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division. He recorded his memories in the 1960s. His account captured the transformation German soldiers experienced during the offensive. They began with hope bordering on euphoria. Finally, they were attacking again. Finally, they would strike a decisive blow against the Americans. The first days seemed to confirm their hopes. American units retreated in disorder. German forces advanced steadily. They captured supplies and equipment. Victory seemed possible once more. But by the fourth day, reality asserted itself with brutal force. American resistance stiffened noticeably. American artillery fire increased dramatically. American counterattacks drove Germans from positions they had taken. Always when weather cleared, came the aircraft. Day after day, American fighters attacked German columns. They destroyed supply trucks. Fuel transports burned. Ammunition carriers exploded. Without supplies, advance became impossible. Without fuel, tanks sat motionless. By Christmas, everyone understood the offensive had failed. By New Year's, they understood they would be lucky to escape back to Germany. When withdrawal finally came in late January, the division had been destroyed. Of the men who attacked on December 16th, fewer than 1/3 returned to German lines. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. They had lost the war in the Ardennes, not because Americans defeated them in battle, but because they defeated themselves. They attacked with inadequate resources. They pursued impossible objectives. They followed delusional planning. 50,000 German soldiers paid with their lives for this delusion. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes were not the same men who had conquered France in 1940. They were not the veterans who had driven deep into the Soviet Union in 1941. Many were teenagers with only weeks of training. They were thrown into combat equipped with outdated weapons. Others were men in their 40s, pulled from factories and offices to fill depleted ranks. The elite SS divisions still contained combat veterans, but their ranks had been heavily diluted with young recruits who lacked experience. Equipment was a mixture of obsolete weapons, captured material from a dozen different nations. German vehicles pressed into service despite mechanical unreliability. Logistics functioned poorly because Germany's transportation network was crumbling under air attack. The Wehrmacht that attacked in the Ardennes bore little resemblance to the powerful force that had dominated Europe 4 years earlier. This was an army of exhausted men, fighting with worn-out equipment, sustained by increasingly unrealistic ideology, driven by desperate hope that somehow, against all evidence, Germany might yet avoid complete defeat. But some elements remained from Germany's earlier victories. German tactical doctrine still emphasized initiative at lower levels. Company and battalion commanders were expected to make decisions. They were expected to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from higher command. This flexibility had served Germany well in earlier campaigns. In the Ardennes, it allowed isolated units to continue attacking even when communications failed, even when the overall offensive had clearly stalled. German tank crews remained highly skilled. The Tiger and Panther tanks, when they had fuel and ammunition, were superior to most Allied armor. German infantry units, when properly led and adequately supplied, fought with determination. None of this changed the strategic reality. Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win. Against enemies who possessed overwhelming material superiority. Tactical excellence and fighting spirit were insufficient when the enemy could absorb losses and replace them, while Germany could not. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the ultimate bankruptcy of Nazi Germany's strategic position. Hitler's strategy since 1943 had been to inflict sufficient casualties on Germany's enemies. This would force them to negotiate rather than continue fighting. This approach assumed that democracies were weak, that the Allies would crumble under losses, that British and American populations would demand peace once casualties mounted. Every aspect of this thinking proved wrong. The Allies were prepared to accept significant casualties to achieve complete German defeat. When American units were overrun in the opening days, American commanders responded by rushing reinforcements to contain the breakthrough, not by considering negotiation. When British forces held key crossings, denying Germans their primary objectives, the British government did not waver in commitment to Germany's unconditional surrender. The Allies understood what Hitler refused to accept. Germany had lost the capacity to alter the war's fundamental trajectory. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated. The question was when and at what cost. The Ardennes offensive added approximately 100,000 German casualties to the final bill, without changing the answer to either question. What the offensive did accomplish was to eliminate any possibility of Germany negotiating a conditional surrender. The massacre at Malmedy and other atrocities committed by SS forces during the offensive removed any sympathy Allied leaders might have felt for Germany. When Piper's forces gunned down American prisoners, when SS troops murdered Belgian civilians, when German forces committed systematic war crimes throughout their advance, they ensured that Allied demands for unconditional surrender and complete occupation would be non-negotiable. Germany would be defeated totally, occupied completely. Its leadership tried for war crimes. The Ardennes offensive made certain there would be no negotiated peace, no conditional surrender, no opportunity for Nazi leadership to escape justice. By February 1945, When the last German forces retreated to the Siegfried Line, the military situation was hopeless. In the east, Soviet armies had closed to within 60 miles of Berlin. In the west, American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine in overwhelming strength. Germany's oil production had been reduced to almost nothing by air attack on synthetic fuel plants. German aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Tanks sat immobilized in defensive positions, unable to maneuver for lack of gasoline. German cities were systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Transportation networks were shattered beyond repair. The economy was collapsing completely. Food supplies were inadequate for military and civilian needs. The Nazi regime controlled Germany through terror, executing soldiers for defeatism, hanging civilians suspected of doubting victory. Germany had become a nightmare state fighting for its own destruction, unable to surrender because the regime preferred to destroy Germany rather than admit defeat, unable to win because victory had ceased to be possible. The soldiers who returned from the Ardennes carried with them the knowledge that Germany was finished. They had seen American material superiority firsthand. They had experienced the weight of Allied air power. They had understood the impossibility of defeating enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Some would fight on from loyalty to their units and comrades. Some fought because desertion meant execution. Some fought because the Nazi regime had destroyed their capacity for independent thought, conditioning them to follow orders regardless of consequences. But few fought, believing victory remained possible. The Ardennes had been Germany's final offensive effort. From February forward, Germany fought purely defensive battles, delaying actions, hopeless last stands in cities that would be destroyed defending them. The war would continue for 3 more months, but its outcome had been determined. Germany would be defeated, occupied, and divided. The Nazi regime would be destroyed, and millions more would die in the final battles, their deaths purchasing nothing except a brief delay of the inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge, from the German perspective, was a story of delusion, denial, and defeat. It was a story of soldiers sent to accomplish the impossible with inadequate resources, by leaders who refused to accept reality. It was a story of tactical proficiency wasted in pursuit of strategic impossibility. It was a story of courage and determination that produced no meaningful result except to hasten the destruction those qualities were meant to prevent. German soldiers in the Ardennes fought as well as any soldiers could be expected to fight under such circumstances. They achieved surprise. They broke through enemy lines. They advanced deep into Belgium. They inflicted significant casualties on American forces. None of it mattered, because the fundamental strategic calculation was wrong. Germany could not defeat the Allied coalition through military operations. Germany lacked the resources for victory. The longer Germany fought, the more completely it would be destroyed. Every German soldier who died in the Ardennes died for nothing. The offensive could never achieve its objectives. Its failure guaranteed Germany's total defeat. The final accounting was brutal and undeniable. Germany lost 100,000 men, 600 tanks, hundreds of aircraft, irreplaceable quantities of fuel and ammunition. In return, Germany delayed Allied operations by 6 weeks. They gained absolutely nothing of strategic value. The Ardennes offensive was a catastrophic failure, but it was more than military defeat. It was the death of the last German illusion that the war could still be won. After the Ardennes, even the most fanatical Nazi understood that Germany faced not just defeat, but destruction. The offensive consumed the last forces capable of delaying that destruction, ensuring that when the final collapse came, it would be swift and total. The Battle of the Bulge, from the German perspective, was the moment when Germany's fate was sealed, when hope died, when the illusion of possible victory finally shattered against the reality of absolute Allied material superiority. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes believed they were fighting for Germany's survival. Instead, they participated in an operation that guaranteed Germany's destruction, ordered by a regime that preferred total catastrophe to admitting error. Launched against enemies whose overwhelming material advantages no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome, the Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive and its final failure. The moment when the mathematics of war proved that willpower and determination were insufficient substitutes for industrial capacity, logistics, and air superiority. From December 16, 1944, when the artillery began, to January 25, 1945, when the last German forces withdrew, Germany waged a battle it could not win, purchased delays it could not afford, consumed resources it could never replace. The result was inevitable defeat, hastened by the very offensive designed to prevent it.